So, Preston, we are here because friend of the channel, Mr. Joker, tagged me in something on Twitter. I brought it to you. Basically, his tweet here is George R. R. Martin has commented on this. Correct me if I'm wrong, Red Team Review, but didn't he say that Game of Thrones is more or less putting a piece of an ice on a raft and pretending it's an iceberg, whereas J.R.R. Tolkien is the iceberg? Which, okay, I brought it to you, and you're like, this is a whole discussion. So I'm like, yeah, let's get into it. Now, did George ever say that? Because I don't know
I
if I can.
mean,
So I can
I
find the
don't
quote.
know. I've never heard that phrase before. Um, and again, like unless you people misquote George all the time, so unless I see him like speaking in context, I can't really say. I'm not going to search for any sort of iceberg quote now or like know what he means.
Hmm.
And plus, like whether he said it or not, it doesn't matter because like people act self-depreciating and humble all the time. So, but the question is if there's truth to it, right? That's what you're kind of more interested in. Like, do you think this is accurate that um, George is dressing up his story as an iceberg while Tolkien is the real deal and isn't dressing it up, or I mean, I see this meme below, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, So the meme below has J.K. Rowling. It says, only start creating lore after you've already finished half of the series, and then keep adding stuff a decade after finishing. Um, George is steal 90% of your deep lore from real life and other authors and fill out your world map. And Tolkien is create an entire universe with bloody theological history with hundreds of characters and dozens of devastating wars, then write a children's book in it.
So let's start with J.K. Rowling real quick. I can kind of see where the meme is coming from when they
Sure.
say that, because a lot of J.K.'s stuff really did come like after the stuff was done. Like information about several characters, their lineages, so on and so forth.
Well, the first two
Um,
books are rather short, right? And um, she was just writing children's books, and then they kind of grew, and then the novels grew, right? And so
Pretty
there was just
much, yeah.
there was a lot more space for lore.
Yeah, pretty much. Also, I don't know if you could steal real world events. I would say inspire.
Um, are we jumping to George and Tolkien? Um,
Yeah, because JK's that's cut and
I mean,
dry.
J.K. like look, J.K. has a very deep has a lot of has a great lore situation. People copy it. There was an entire like now like the whole magic school thing is a whole genre that people steal from now. But I mean, everything is derivative. Like everybody steals from everybody else. So like George stealing 90% of lore from real life history and other authors, I'd put it higher than 90%. But
Damn.
no, I mean, he steals from himself as well. He takes from his old stories the previous ideas, and he has real life history. He has his previous stories, and then he has other fantasy writers and such that he steals from. But that's life. You take what you know and you repurpose it. I mean, Shakespeare stole um, plots and ideas and all sorts of stuff. Hamlet is based on another play called Hamlet, But so, um, meanwhile, like Tolkien create an entire universe. He didn't create the universe. I mean, come on, like it's still just Europe, right?
Uh, I mean, I can see hints of Europe in there, but because
I
we
mean,
did a
look,
previous
you're
recording
talking
that we
like
didn't go into, but
so brief history of of Europe. You have the Roman Empire, and then half of the Roman Empire falls. And what we think of the
mhm.
Middle Ages, we think of the area of that used to be under Rome, France, Spain, England, um, that that even though it's somewhat of a myth, but the idea is that it's falling into a dark age. It's falling into the Middle Ages. Middle Ages meaning like between the classical period and the Renaissance. Like that's what Middle Ages means. It's assuming a dark age. So there is a fall of Rome, and then there's eventually a Renaissance, but then there's an eastern part of the Roman Empire that doesn't fall, that just that in many people's minds the Byzantine Empire kind of festers, or whatever, just kind of sits there stagnant. And so I mean, Middle Earth is, you've got Gondor, like Arnor and Gondor represent the eastern and western half of the Roman Empire, where one falls and they go into a more medieval lifestyle, and the city Gondor is still there, kind of as Byzantium, and then the villains are in literally the southeast. These tanned men riding exotic animals, right? It's the same set, and then there's a continent off across the ocean. There's nothing creating here. He just took Europe. What? And not to mention all of these creatures and everything he just takes from folklore. People talk about people make these large statements like Tolkien created elves and things like that. No, he didn't. Elves as the Alfar, he takes from the Alfar, they all of that existed in folklore.
Mm-hmm.
It's true that for a long time the evolution of elves became kind of these mischievous little things in the Victorian era, but people were talking about the adult elves being the size of people and stuff long before that. I mean, Midsummer's Night's Dream has fairies, but fairies and elves were used, the terms were used interchangeably, and the elves, the fairies in that are human size. Oberyn, the king of fairies, and Puck and such. So there's I mean, the idea of the elves just come from old Celtic fairy tales and such, and I mean he takes all of this. So I don't understand this idea that he just created it all. No, that's not true. He took stuff and adapted it like everybody else.
Sure, but he still has it. I think the meme also just highlights how he still has this entire universe with just all this history and hundreds of characters and dozens of devastating wars, and then he writes a children's book in it, which is what The Hobbit is. Which, okay, yeah,
but when he wrote The Hobbit, he had the intention of eventually writing Lord of the Rings. He didn't
is that
do
true?
that. Yeah, he did. He didn't just do this all for this children's book. I mean, he had the eventual intention of writing Lord of the Rings. He wasn't just doing it for fun.
We got to get Joker back on again, by the way, and ask him about this, because he has some really awesome ideas and conversation topics on Ice and Fire, and I would love to pick his brain on this one. But as for George R.R. Martin, I don't know if I would say steal. I would say inspire from real, based off this meme, from real life history and other authors to fill out your world map. I mean, I guess, but
I mean, look, George's stuff, it's filled with a lot of borrowed stuff. It's filled with a lot of lazy stuff here and there. There's cut corners here and there, but at the same time, he takes everything and he makes it into something very, very engaging. He creates something new, and so in the end, who, I don't know, does it matter so much? Does it matter that the Stark Lannister rivalry is based on the
War of the Roses.
War of the Roses? Is that really, is that really important to know? How much inspiration is that? Is it important that the werewood is named after Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead? When you're creating these scenes of this bloody werewood and Bran being creeped out about it and it being a stand-in for heaven, yes, that's all stolen from his previous stuff about A Song for Leah, and I'm sure there's other sci-fi stuff and fantasy stuff before that where there was the thought experiment of having a real life heaven. I mean, I've heard the thought experiment my whole life where people are if there was actually a box that you could go in where you could live forever, but it would be an illusion, and you'd be happy, but it'd be an illusion, and you could live forever. Like, would you do it? And people's answer are often like no, but that's heaven. I mean, that's what heaven is. Um,
Yeah,
so, and that's what the
that's an
werewood net
interesting
is,
one.
and that's what the Grishka
Hmm.
is, and stuff like that. So, he's just applying something that existed and putting it into a story, but that's what life is, right? Life is about finding things and applying them. No one creates from nothing. Um, Plus,
True,
like,
but also, can you even steal from yourself though? Because you keep saying that. Can
right.
you steal from
Can you
yourself?
steal for yourself recycling ideas? No, I mean, I guess not. I mean, it's not plagiarism. Because plagiarism is specifically from other people, but like you're borrowing from yourself or recycling your stuff. That's fine. Um, and uh, but also like theological history, like, I mean, you know, it's just it's just God and the devil, like God and the devil fighting over and over again. Like, like it's not, there's little things here and there, sure, and he shoves it in and it's interesting and he does a great job. But like let's not have any illusion that it's from nothing. That this is a wholly, like, solely original kind of thing with no precedent before it. That's ridiculous. Um
Well, on the topic of him stealing stuff and any other author stealing stuff, it's only bad if you suck. It's only bad, and it only
right.
ever gets brought up if it's not that great.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Like, if you do a good job, everybody's like, yeah, it's fine. I mean, it's like anything else, right? Like people complain about every aspect of media. Like, oh my gosh, that movie, like, it doesn't have enough minorities. It has too many minorities. Like, oh this oh, this character development happened too fast. This character development happened too slow. Like, you can come up with all these little things, but in the end, if it's good, like, no one cares. Like, no one cares.
Reminds me of these minor details about whether someone stole something only ever pop up because someone on Reddit found it on Wikipedia and put it on Reddit for karma points. I'm reminded of the Lion King
Mm,
actually stealing from the Japanese anime Kimbo the White Lion, like
yeah.
literally like scene for scene stealing. And it doesn't matter because Lion King is legendary. Everybody loves it. Kids love it. So fuck it.
Mm. I also want to bring up something quickly about putting Tolkien on a pedestal. Um,
Oh boy, come on. We gotta. If I knew you were gonna do this, I would have Yoiston come on with us so
yeah,
he
no,
can.
but it's not that Tolkien isn't great, and but I'm reminded of, recently I saw a video on The Simpsons, and apparently The Simpsons is good again. Um, it's
I
I
think
have
I
to,
saw that video that you're talking about.
yeah. I have not watched The Simpsons in 2 decades, but like, he did I watched this and there was analysis, and it's like, oh my god, like season 33 is like all of a sudden like a really good season. Um, which is crazy, right? I mean, it's sort of like the Fast and the Furious movies. Like, they started out kind of really unremarkable kind of things, and then all of a sudden, like, Fast and the Furious 5 comes out, and everybody's like, wait a minute, this movie is much better than the previous four, right? Simpsons is all of a sudden good again. But he's like, okay, it's good again, but is it as good as like the golden age of Simpsons, like way
No,
back in the day, like season 6? And
no, it's not possible.
well, the problem is he goes through these episodes, and each of the episodes it's just like every other line is like iconic, right? But at the same time, he then like went on bulletin boards of the time when these episodes came out, and people were trashing the season, and saying like, oh, this and this was wrong, this and this was wrong, oh my god, this was mid. But you can't, something does happen to media over time where even if something's bad, it can become iconic, and then all of a sudden it can become kind of good. Um,
Like the
I
prequels, kinda.
so I once a buddy of mine was wanted to watch the top 100 movies, like the that the list that comes out, the international film AFI, is that was it? I don't know, like film list of the
Sounds
top
about
100.
right. Yeah.
Anyway, so we started renting back in the days of rentals. We started renting a bunch of them, and I ended up. I'm glad we did it. We quit. We didn't make it through. We watched like a dozen of the 100. Um, so, but it was good that I did it because a lot of movies I had never seen, like Bridge Over the River Kwai, or Midnight Cowboy and stuff like that, I saw, and I'm happy I saw them. But even if I didn't think they were that great of movies, like I didn't think, like having seen Midnight Cowboy, I realized Midnight Cowboy is overrated in my mind. The Graduate, incredibly overrated. Um, Dustin Hoffman is great in both of them, but like he's actually Dustin Hoffman isn't that great in The Graduate. Dustin Hoffman's great in Midnight Cowboy. Dustin Hoffman's not great in The Graduate. He just stands there. But you kind of realize like I'm not of that generation. That movie wasn't iconic to me, and and um like those scenes don't land with me. Like, and I just
Mm.
didn't think it was good. Like, I just don't think. And I understand that like certain scenes, like the end of The Graduate is the classic example of the guy running in and stopping a wedding. And this has been reused over and over again. And I can understand why it would become iconic, but like by itself, like, I mean, the ending of The Graduate's okay. It's probably the best part of the movie. The rest of the movie is just kind of sitting around doing nothing. But like,
The ending
um,
is where they're on the bus and then like
yeah,
they
the
they
bus, and they're
realize
like,
what.
"What the fuck did we do?"
Yeah.
Um, that's kind of the best part. The rest of the movie is a waste of time, but uh, but it's overrated. Like, and I was like, but because like I didn't have those blinders on. But imagine you're with The Simpsons. We all kind of know we don't have the blinders on. We all have those iconic lines in our head, and so if we go back to season 6, we're like, well, this is just an incredible episode, you know. Um, so I think there's a lot of that with Tolkien. Like we can't we can't we can't objectively look at Tolkien like at this point and say whether it's like good or bad, because there's just too many things that we think are iconic, and we
Mm.
have nostalgia and all sorts of things, you know. I mean, you're a bit younger than me, but you're of the generation of people that were like that really have a nostalgia for the prequel trilogy of Star Wars, you know, like
It was so weird. Like in 1999, which for those of you who don't know, I was born in 91. In 1999, the marketing was phenomenal for Phantom Menace. Like it
yeah.
was just phenomenal. But even as a kid, after watching in the movie theaters and enjoying it then, even as a kid when it came on TV on reruns, I don't know, just something about it, I just couldn't get into it. I don't know.
Mm,
The prequels are looked on more fondly, I think, for Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, and I feel like a lot of the memes really help
yeah.
people digest it a bit more now. It's more palatable because of the hello there. It's
Yeah.
over, Anakin, the high ground. You know, like just I don't know. Like there's just something about you have to incorporate meme culture in there, but it's even as a kid, I still like the original trilogy better.
Time does something weird though. Like there's a lot of music that when I was in high school I hated. I hated. And now like it comes on the radio, and like nostalgia comes in, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, it kind of rocks. And you're like, no, it didn't at the time. I hated it at the time. So like, you
Which
know,
song specific?
I think was specifically like I was not a fan of like I was really not a fan of like GNR Use Your Illusion album when it came out. Um, I thought it was overly flowery and ridiculous. And
Guns N' Roses?
mhm, yeah, I remember as a kid like liking Welcome to the Jungle,
Hmm.
and but then I remember hating Paradise City, and I hated Sweet Child of Mine. I
What?
hated it. Yeah, hated them.
What?
Hated Patience. Hated it. Um, I think I liked You Will Be Mine. And then I just thought November Rain was a big waste of time. It's maybe the ending I kind of liked, but yeah, and then just time changes, and you're just like, no, all of it rocks now. I listen to it now, and I'm like, no, all of it rocks. Like I don't get, like I don't. And
Hmm.
granted, human beings change and what we appreciate changes, but also like I like it's just nostalgia. Like nostalgia bites you and changes your opinion of things. You know, because
We're
if
gonna
the
get to
rest
it
of
later, but
society, if the rest of society is like that's an incredible line, you start thinking it's an incredible line, even if it's not really that incredible.
we're gonna get to this later. But I really think a lot of people that even you and I come into clash with online in terms of like certain things. A lot of people really are stuck in their cage of nostalgia. That really
Mm-hmm.
prevents them from liking anything new. And I feel like you and I are pretty good about like not being
Yeah,
bogged down by that. I
but
feel
you know,
like we
you have to
are.
ask yourself, like, is Robert De Niro looking in a mirror, saying, like, "You looking at me"? Is that really that great of a scene? Or because that line is so iconic, do we think that's a great scene now? Like, is it really that fantastic? Like Robert De Niro looking in a mirror going, "You looking at me? You looking at me?" Like, I don't know. I don't know the answer. Like, because we're all biased. We're all in this like nostalgia bubble. Um, so I don't know.
I'll be very real with you. I came across this thing. Someone posted on Reddit about how they were rereading The Lord of the Rings, and this one moment, the Siege of Gondor, really made them tear up, right?
Mm,
And I'm someone who I've scrolled through the Lord of the Rings books, no problem, but I watched the movies first, and I understand what you're saying about like Tolkien because here's a page from the Siege of Gondor.
yeah.
It's the moment where the Witch King of Angmar comes and confronts Gandalf. "You cannot enter here," said Gandalf. The huge saddle halted. "Go back to the abyss prepared for you. Fall back, go back. Fall into the nothingness that awaits you and your master. Go!" The Black Rider flung back his hood, and behold, he had a knight kingly crown, and yet upon no head visible was it set. The red fires shone between it, and the mantled shoulders vast and dark. From the mouth unseen there came a deadly laughter. "Old fool," he said, "old fool, this is my hour. Do you not know death when you see it? Die now and curse in vain." Comparing this to like the lines in the movie, like the lines in the movies are just perfect, just
Yeah.
fucking phenomenal. "Go back to the abyss, fall into the nothingness that await." Like it cuts out a lot of like Tolkien's, whole thing where everything is just like grand and curse
Right.
you.
I mean, Tolkien. I mean, Lord of the Rings, the books, like the book. I mean, in three parts. It's a he creates a completely different atmosphere than Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson's interpretation of Lord of the Rings is very weird to me. I understand that like having a lot of people having seen the movies first, it's now like their set kind of default interpretation. But it was I always found it very weird, like overly dour, overly sad, like, and yet you can't really get that feeling with Lord of the Rings because Lord of the Rings, like the language is clunky and flowery and makes you think you're reading a fairy tale the whole time. The way a lot of the sentences are structured and stuff like that to give it this like old timey feel. Um, well, Lord of the Rings, the movie, kind of, even though it's mid fantasy, it doesn't seem old timey. Does that make sense? I don't know.
It makes sense. I know where you're coming from.
You know, so it's I don't know, but an entire pages of songs and silly hobbits and Tom Bombadil and there, all sorts of other things, but these like
Is that because you
ridiculous.
grew up with the cartoon Lord of the Rings? So you were
Probably
kind
that's
of like,
probably like probably definitely colored my opinions. Um, I always thought Lord of the Rings was silly and playful. The way that Tolkien wrote was silly and playful. And so even when you have these like epic speeches, I almost see them as like playful because you know it's sort of like how like Thor speak, where he's just like where he's saying something that's like ridiculously old timey in a modern setting. Like that's how I always felt about Lord of the Rings, and that was
mm.
somehow the intention. But maybe maybe I'm wrong. But you never get that with the movies. The movies are so fucking earnest and serious. Nothing
I and
playful
I
about them.
kind of I kind of love that. Like they get to the
Yeah.
point. Like even Game of Thrones kind of does that. I don't have it with me. I don't know if you want to pull it up, but like in the books, a Game of Thrones, when Jaime
Yeah.
confronts Ned, like the show, in my opinion, the show like cut out a lot of the fat of that whole scene, and like only the lines in the show like really truly make sense. Like in the books, there's just more stuff added onto it that I don't feel like is necessary. Like David
Mm.
Dane did a great job with that, and like I feel like Peter Jackson did a great job like getting to the point with the interactions between the characters. But with Tolkien, I think like he's so revered because he's kind of really the base of every bit of fantasy we ever consume now, right? Like it all
George
comes
R.
down to
Martin.
him.
See, the thing is, George R. Martin is also more playful than like Game of Thrones, the show, which is very earnest and serious and dour. But like George R. Martin's playfulness is a very dark humor at times. You know, like I'm just thinking of how the um, wine cellar is dealt with in Game of Thrones versus like how he's dealt with in the books. Like, because I think, um, like you know, it's straight up earnest in the show where the guy is like tied behind Danny, um, naked, and then um, he I want to say, but there was something with the wine cellar in the how it was written in Game of Thrones. I'm trying to think. It was like as long as he kept up or something. You know, like this court is like have to bring up the like my search or something for a search of ice and fire if I can. But there's something like there's like dark humor. Let's see here. We'll do the search. Uncheck all of this. Um, I know. Is it kept up? Try to remember it right. Yeah, here it is. As she rode, he ran after, barefoot and stumbling. No harm would come to him, so long as he kept up. You know, like that's in a dark humor sense. That's a very
Right.
playful and funny way to describe it. Um, that is not in the show. The show is just very earnest. The guy is behind and he's gonna die, and that's it. But to purposely be like no harm is going to come to him as long as he keeps up, which that's just dark. But yeah, what were we talking about? How did we get on this?
I wanted to ask you briefly. Um, So every now and then I'll check out this YouTuber DJ Vlad. DJ Vlad covers topics in the hip hop and occasionally the black community, and as such, he'll have on comedians, actors, rappers,
Mm, mm, mm.
athletes, and so on and so forth. And every now and then, whenever he has on a comedian, he always asks the comedian, "Who's on your Mount Rushmore of comics?" And they'll usually say, Richard Pryor, George Carlin, so on and so forth. I'm going to throw this question at you and at the audience as well. Who
Yeah.
would you put on your Mount Rushmore of fantasy authors? I could go first if you'd like.
Okay, you go.
So Tolkien, of course, he's number. Oh, by the way, I should
Mm-hmm.
probably explain this because it's gonna sound so stupid. I know people are gonna go, Carmine. We know what Mount Rushmore is, right? But there's always foreigners who like, people overseas who don't really know certain parts about American history and how things are in America. For those of you who don't know, Mount Rushmore is this place in the United States where they carve the
They
heads
they
of historical presidents.
they took some holy land from some American Indians and then desecrated the holy mountain by carving in four presidents. But yes, yes,
So, Mount Rushmore, yeah. So my Mount Rushmore of fantasy writers
hmm.
would be it's always Tolkien is number one, of course, because he's like the base. Like
Yeah,
I don't want to say he popularized fantasy, but I feel like a lot of people drew inspiration for him. A lot of people that we love, and if it wasn't for him, I feel like the world of fantasy and entertainment in general would probably be a bit of a different place. So
yeah,
Tolkien gets the number one slot. Number two, I always go back and forth on who really should take number two. Either Michael Moorcock, who is another influential figure in fantasy, versus C.S. Lewis, who is the guy behind Chronicles of Narnia, which I personally enjoy. Um, and then number three, love the series, hate the author, Sapkowski, the guy who wrote The Witcher.
Hmm.
And number four is another fight beat, and this counts, even though it's manga, it counts, is a fight between I know. It's a fight between Kentaro Miura, who wrote Berserk,
Yeah.
versus Ichiro Oda, who writes One Piece. In case you're wondering, George is not on there. No, he's not, because you don't get to be on the Mount Rushmore of fantasy writers because you didn't finish. And let me just add a little bit here. If whoever's watching this right now, if you want to put Robert Jordan on there, go for it. I would allow that because Robert Jordan wrote until he died. Like, he had
Hmm.
every intention of finishing, and unfortunately he passed away. George, we're out here waiting what, 10, 12, 13 years for Winds of Winter with like no major update in sight about when it's coming come.
Okay.
So if George came out, I'll give George this. If he comes out with Winds of Winter tomorrow, I'll put him number two slot over Moorcock slash C.S. Lewis. But for now, like, he doesn't get to be on there for me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this would change over time. Like if we all lived a century later, I think it'd be very different. Um, so I think when I look at the the mountain, I'd have to think about like influence, right? Um,
Mm.
and so I would say that I would put Tolkien on there, and then I'd put Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft would probably be number two slot.
I'd
I
have to
think I
challenge you on that. I'd have to
yeah
challenge you on that because he's more. I feel like he's more
horror.
sci-fi because of the cosmic horror. Yeah.
I guess it's just like how they all flow into each other and stuff like that. I mean, you know, what makes fantasy and what makes more horror. Because then I would say that like the creator of Conan the Barbarian, Robert Howard, what
I think that's his name. I think
would
it's Robert
probably
Howard.
be,
Yeah.
if we're really talking about like the influence on fantasy, like he's really super important. And then and even though this again would be classified as sci-fi, like you would have to put like Frank Herbert on there for Dune, just because even though he didn't finish because he died, but like
He had every intention to finish.
so sometimes we need to have another discussion about like why Dune is so powerful despite being an unfinished series. Well, I don't think there's much to it, but Dune is powerful because Dune itself is a standalone story and a standalone book, and then became a series, and the rest of the series is kind of just an amendment to Dune or a reaction to Dune. But like Dune itself is a story and a book by itself. And Game of Thrones is not. You can't just take a Game of Thrones and be like, well, this is a book. This is a story when the whole thing ends on a cliffhanger, and nothing's resolved. But so I'd put Frank Herbert just because like when I think of sci-fi and fantasy stories today and who they draw from and who they just mimic, I think of those four authors the most.
Mm-hmm.
Like when somebody wants to do something horrific and they want to create monsters, they just go back to Lovecraft. And even Lovecraft like was just taking random things like fish and tentacles from squids or whatever. And when you think of like gritty fantasy, modern fantasy, you really think of Conan the Barbarian. And when you think of like the high fantasy ideals of like how magic and conspiracies and work, you really think of Frank Herbert. And when I say about like I'm talking about like rule based magic. Like magic at one point was just people did shit. People just did shit. Even in Tolkien, people just do shit. There's no like limits on and explanation for how and why these things happen. And so sci-fi kind of put little limits on that. And so you kind of need that and when it comes to like how we see modern fantasy, because modern fantasy is very rule based, coming from, going through Dungeons and Dragons and being like, well, I have a set amount of like magic energy that I'm allowed to use and stuff like that. There's a lot more limits on magic. And I mean, when you look at even uh, Sanderson, like his magic systems are very like rule based and structured and stuff. So is it, yeah, that's four. I named four, right?
You had Tolkien, Robert Jordan, not Robert Jordan. You had Robert Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, and who was the fourth?
Uh, Frank Herbert.
Frank Herbert. By the way, have you ever like checked out his son's Dune stuff?
I have Robert E. Howard.
I keep I keep hearing people say that like his son it feels like his son wants to be approached by a Hollywood studio so they could
Mm-hmm.
make his books into a movie because he likes them to be action oriented, whereas Frank Herbert was more interested in putting like philosophical themes in Dune, and like it's night and day between the two.
Okay, so how I would describe his son, and keep in mind that like the stuff I know his son has Brian Herbert does have his own sci-fi novels. He does, and but Brian Herbert's also like co-wrote with Kevin J. Anderson, so their writing is kind of together, and so I think you get a lot of Kevin J. Anderson's writing, um, in that too, and so um very different writing style. Kevin J. Anderson is very clear, concise, fast writer. You can read a Kevin J. Anderson page in no time at all and completely absorb everything that he has said. And so in that sense, he's a very, very good writer. And he does it so fast. He does it so fast.
Mm.
This guy, I mean, but he's also modern. He's a modern when I interviewed him and he writes books, he goes on walks and narrates them. And I was like, oh my God, like you can stream of consciousness, like just, I'm sure he goes back and like tries to like fix up little things, but it's like, that's incredible. That you can just like, just going along, like talking in your head, like, and pull off writing. But it's a very different style from, um, Frank Herbert, who some people would say was, is not exactly the best of like writers with words. Um, so uh, I don't know the different writing style, but also Brian Herbert is doing the same thing as Christopher Tolkien. He's analyzing everything his father did and then running a business empire at the same time,
Mm.
which is a job in and of itself. You know, like the Tolkien estate has a bunch of people like trying to run all of their money and like plan their books and deal with like rights and stuff like that. So when you think of like Brian Herbert, like he has to spend a lot of time with Hollywood talking about like the Dune movie and like, and dealing with things like that. And then thinking about what books need to be released in order to keep constant interest in the Dune franchise. So like over the years, because and to be honest, he's been very successful. Like when I think of when I was a teenager, every person's like, "Oh, you have to read Dune at some point as a teenager," and that's still true today. Um, besides Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, like what other book can you say can like even like a teenager is still expected to read in fantasy? Um,
Hmm. That's a good
I,
question, actually.
considering
Besides
it
Harry
was,
Potter as well, because you know.
yeah, I mean, even Harry Potter, I think is beginning to die out with the next generation. I mean, I don't know. Um,
You think so?
well, it's hard to say because like the people that are super into Harry Potter are in their 40s right now, and so they have
30s,
kids.
40s, yeah.
Yeah, they
Hmm.
have kids, and they're pushing the kids to probably read the stuff too. So maybe that'll happen. But independently, just people just find Dune over and over again. Independently, they just find Dune. So I think there's something, and he does, when you go into a bookstore, there's always another Dune book out. You're always reminded that Dune exists. Oh, a movie is coming, another movie. Every 15 years there's an adaptation and stuff like that. So I don't know. He's a writer. I think Brian Herbert is a writer. He's a good writer. He's a writer at a different time with a different writing style. He might be a better writer than Frank Herbert, but Frank Herbert had all the original ideas. So I don't know. Depends how one defines good writing. So
Right. I should also probably tell the audience that we were going Mount Rushmore. You were going by based on influence. I go by based off like impact influence. Yeah, how good of a storyteller they are. So writing prose, we're not really going to get into that. Probably should
yeah,
have
that's
said
the thing.
that
And
at
once
the
you get to
beginning.
writing prose, like George R. R. Martin is a fucking master at writing prose. Like he's just fucking great. Like such a gripping writing. Just a gripping writer. I mean, Stephen King is a master at that too. It just doesn't go anywhere. It's just stream of consciousness. But but yeah, I don't know. Um, Robert Jordan, great writer when it comes to prose. So, ugh, these differences. Yeah, it's like at some point you're comparing apples and oranges.